Yes, I'm Chris, and it's awesome that you are all here. First, I want to thank the organizers. I think they did a really good job. I'm very impressed by everything that happened so far. It's been so smooth, and it's really cool that there's such a big thing going on here. I'm generally very impressed by what is going on in Warsaw. It seems like you guys are doing everything right. And I wanted to say, one of the things for me that's really important about conference is also talking to people. So not as a presentation, but afterwards and in between. And I would encourage you to do the same, talk to each other, but also if you have questions, ask me or ask the other speakers, because I think everybody would be very happy to answer that. These are the hashtags the organizers asked to use. So the first one is about the conference, and the second one is about this talk. So if you want to talk about the talk on Twitter or anywhere else, you can use the second hashtag. Okay, so my title is The Evolution of a Cocoa Programmer, and this is me 5 years ago. I'm the guy on the left, and on the right is Eelco, my friend, and we had a company together, Tupil. And what we did is we started the company without actually knowing what we wanted to do. We had been working for a boss, but we didn't really like it. And then we were like, no, let's start a company. And we didn't really have a plan. So we were doing some PHP programming and some other things. And then we started to make a game, Cookie Combo, for this new platform, iOS. And we didn't know anything about this. This was 5 years ago. It was iOS 2.0. And the iPhone, I was not too impressed by it, actually. I was like, yeah, whatever, it's a smartphone. And we started making this game, and we tweeted a bit about it. Nothing big. And we sold maybe a few €100 worth of games in the last few years for this game. So it was not a big success in that respect. But what happened is all the companies that saw us tweet about this, they started calling us and saying, yeah, can you make our iPhone app? And we said, no, we cannot do this. We don't know how to do this. I will show you also why we didn't know. We had no idea how to make iPhone apps. We made one game, but we didn't really feel competent. We were just faking it, you know? And so my talk is about what happened in between this and this. Does anybody know where this picture comes from? Can I see a hand if anybody knows? 1, 2, 3. Okay, 4. So I write this magazine, Objective-C.io. Some of you might know it. And this is our last issue. And our last issue was about quadcopters, where we taped this very iPhone under the quadcopter, and we controlled it with another iPhone. And this is me running after the quadcopter because, of course, we made lots of bugs in our code. And I had to run after it because otherwise we would lose both the quadcopter and my iPhone. So check out the video in the latest issue of Objective-C.io. And you can see me running and trying to chase it. So I still have my iPhone. And this is my very first commit. So you can see that it's exactly 5 years and a few days ago. And one more interesting thing about this is you can see the time. It's at 12 o'clock. And I remember that back then we started about 9 o'clock. So it took us 3 hours to commit an empty project. Things were a bit different back then. Okay. And when we started iOS programming, I was really confident. I was like, yes, I can do this. You know, I knew all these programming languages. I was doing PHP and Ruby and Haskell, and I felt really, really secure. And I was like, I can build anything. Like, you just give me a language, and I will make it for you. I was thinking, yeah, I mean, how hard can it be? So this is example code. What I did for this talk is I went to my archive directory, and I looked up cookiecombo.xcode project. And that's the very first thing. That's the commit you just saw. And I have some code from this project from 5 years ago, when I didn't know anything about iOS programming. This is the first kind of thing. It's a Tableview cell, and it has a lot of properties, and all these properties are instance variables. This is a little bit down in that file. Back then you didn't only have to declare instance variables, but also the properties. And you can see that it's really horrible. It's like the names is name1, name2, name3, and position 1, position 2, position 3. It's not good code. And then in the implementation file, I don't know who remembers this, but you also had to write all the synthesize directives. So that's the kind of code I was looking at. And to be very honest, like the worst code, I'm not going to even show that because it's really big and it didn't fit on my slides, literally. That was the problem. So there are some more things. This is one of the things I literally just copy-pasted. And it says at the very top, as of here, it is completely broken. So we can look at the code, what happens. So first we check if the superview is nil. That seems sort of innocent. Then we start the menu tune. I think that's fine. And then we start simulating view controller containment. So view will appear, view will disappear, remove from superview. And this kind of code was everywhere in our code base. And when I looked at it, I was really shocked. I think it's a good thing to be shocked by the code you wrote 5 years ago. It means that I at least learned a little bit. And I don't know, like these days you should totally use view controller containment. This is another really nice gem. So here I copy-pasted this from when the high score was going to be submitted. So first we create an NSURL, then a mutable URL request, we set the time interval. And at the very bottom, you see this line response data equals NSURL connection send synchronous request. And what is going to happen here is this code is going to block the main thread, luckily for only 4 seconds maximum, and nothing is going to happen, and the user cannot do anything. And it's horrible. You should never do this. So this is one of the things I really learned, like never do synchronous requests ever. Even with Grand Central Dispatch, don't do synchronous requests. Always do things asynchronously and use a good abstraction. Because blocking the main thread or blocking any thread is really not what you want. And then as I was preparing this talk, I was like, okay, I can show you all the things I do now, but it might also be really interesting to see what I did to improve a lot. And there are some things that, well, like in the whole talk, some things that will be very obvious to you, and hopefully some things that are not obvious only afterwards. And this is the most important thing. I think it was Ola who tweeted a while ago saying like, yeah, like a developer takes over a code base and is so happy with the new code base he gets, because this never happens. Like anytime I got a code base from somebody else, I was really sad, because it's really hard to understand other people's code. And as I was, like one time I was complaining about this guy, and he made this horrible code. And I realized I do exactly the same thing. And I was really shocked by that. And I started thinking about what can I do to make it easier for other people to read my code. And I think it's really hard. I'm still not very good at it. But focusing on this one thing really helped me improve my code. So focusing on how you name things and how you structure things and really taking the effort to do that right made my code a lot better. So I came up with a name yesterday, EDD, Embarrassment-Driven Development. And I think it's a good thing. Like, try to not be embarrassed about your code. And you will be, and I am all the time. But as long as I realize it and start doing a little bit about it, it will get better. So I can encourage you, like, try to focus on the next person that's going to come after you and write your code for them. So for me, the next person might be somebody who takes over my project, but it might also be myself in a year from now. Because if I look at my code from a year ago, it's often that I don't understand it. So focus on this. One of the other things I do is I write a lot of code. And one of the things where I learned a lot is by working with other people. I will tell a little bit more about that. And writing articles. And reading books and code. Like, I try to read also books from beyond Objective-C programming, like about Java programming or about enterprise architecture, because that's where the hidden gems are. I will show some things in my presentation, and I think one of the books, if you're interested in afterwards in learning more about this, it's Code Complete. It's really good. It shows you a lot of tips and techniques to write better code. So this is the two types of code I write. I write a lot of production code, and I write a lot of throwaway code. And this last thing is something I started doing only maybe a year ago. So what I do typically on a working day is I start coding, and then I have a problem, and I want to test something. Maybe I want to test a new library, or I want to test how something works. And then the thing that I do now is I press Command-Shift-N, create a new Xcode project, and start testing there. And I have a separate testing folder, so it doesn't clutter my main development folder. And this is really powerful for me. It might not work for you, but for me, it's extremely cool because I can test without having to worry that I have to recompile my whole project or that I change things in my project and I break things. So this is a screenshot from September and October. And you can see, like, around the 17th of September at the very bottom, I started making a lot of small test projects. And it's really cool. It's really useful. And I called it in my previous slide throwaway code. But it's actually, I keep it around. Because later I can see, I know, like, I remember, okay, I did these things with a text field. And I can go to this project, open it again, and see what I did there. And this is something that really liberated me in writing more experimental code without messing up my project. And this is another thing I started doing a lot in the last years, collaborating. And there are two things. So it's obvious that if you work with somebody who's a lot more experienced, that you're going to learn a lot. I was working with Daniel last year, and he's one of my Objective-C.io co-founders, and he's very, very experienced. And just by sitting next to him and showing him my problems, I learned tons of stuff. I think this, I guess this is very obvious. What was not obvious to me is that I was also learning a lot by working with people who had never done iOS programming. So this is Florian, my other Objective-C.io co-founder. And Florian, when we started working together about a year and a half ago, he was completely new to iOS. And we were sitting at our computers and we were pair programming every single day. And I was the experienced guy. I knew everything, I thought. And we were working. And then Florian asked me, like, yeah, why do you do it like that? And then I said, well, we always do it like that. That's how you do it. And then he's like, yeah, but I don't understand. And then I had to look it up. And he did the same thing. And he's a lot better at looking these things up. And by doing this, again, I learned so much. So I can totally recommend that. If there's somebody that is like the same kind of smartness, but very unexperienced that you can work with, do it, because you're going to get a lot better. It really worked well for me. And this is one of the other things, like writing articles is super good to learn. And I'm a bit surprised, but I'm waiting, like, within, I would think within a year, that there's something very big gonna come out of Poland, because there's all these smart people here. You have all the really good designers here. Everything that comes from Poland looks really nice. And I think there will be some kind of blog coming from Poland about iOS development. Well, we'll have to see. But the people that are going to do it are going to learn a lot. Because if you have to write an article about some technology, you have to you are forced to think about the subject. And I get this all the time. I start writing a new article for my magazine, and it's a topic I know a lot about, and then when I write it, I realize what I don't know. So I was writing an article, for example, about asynchronous programming. And I've always been using Grand Central Dispatch. And Grand Central Dispatch has been my friend for years. And then I was writing the article, and I realized, no, I have to use NS operation queues as I was doing my research. And now my code is a lot better because I use NS operation queues everywhere. And just, if I wouldn't have written the article, I would not have needed to think about this, and my code would have been worse. So I can totally recommend this. We're almost getting to the code part. This is another thing. I guess everybody does this, but still it's good repeating, like really learn your frameworks. Like CoreData, for example, is an investment, but it will pay off. And reading the documentation over and over and over again and reading examples and books will make you a faster and a better programmer. And things like UI Tableview controller. Only recently I learned about all the nice little things that are in there that the UI Tableview controller will do for you. And reading the documentation on this, even if it's a class you know really well, because you use it every day, you will learn new things. And it pays off to invest some time in that. And also the new technologies, this is always very painful. When Apple comes with a new version of iOS, then you have to dive into all the new things and learn all the new things. And it's worth it. It's worth the time. Like take some time off in the evening or maybe at work and go over these frameworks and see what they give you. Okay, so one last thing before we go to the code is, I'm going to show a graph of what I know, like my absolute knowledge. So this is over the years. I sketched it a little bit. So I would say like, this is programming knowledge. So I started programming in 1999. And I learned more and more and more. And then in 2008 or 2009, I had a sort of burn down, and I didn't program too much. So maybe my knowledge went down a little bit, and then it went up again. And recently, it's been growing a lot. And the next graph is the same one, but also with how much I think I know. That's the black line. And this goes down because I realize the more I learn, the more stuff I know that I don't know. And I think it's a good thing. I'm getting more insecure about programming the more I know, because I realize that it's really hard, and there's a lot of things I don't know, and again I'm getting humble because of that. And by being humble, I'm forced again to improve myself and to read, and it's a good thing. So just like if you take this advice and try to become a better programmer, I hope it will help you. There's one more thing. The only thing that really matters, because actually my whole talk is not important, the only thing that really matters, in my opinion, is shipping products. If you ship something that's super cool and the code is horrible, you still win. I think it's a lot better than writing really code and not shipping. So you can forget my whole talk. Like if you focus on this, it's also really good. Okay, so these are the three things I really want to talk about. So some small things I started doing. I want to talk about value objects, and I want to talk about lighter view controllers. Okay, the small things are things that I saw when I went over my code from a few years ago that I would do different now. So this is one example. It says if button index is 0. It looks pretty harmless, and I could write it again today. But when I went over this code, I wanted to know, okay, what does it do? So one of the things I started doing is all the time I have a magic constant, I started writing it like this. Button index is equal to start button. It's a very small change. It's not hard if you use app code. It's actually really easy to make this change. But it will make your code a lot better because you're going to read your code more often than you're going to write it. And when you read this, at least it's totally obvious what is meant here. So anytime now I use a number in my code, a magic number, I try to put it into a constant. It's a very simple thing. This is another thing. I was reading through my code, and and I saw this line of code. So if the game state is running or training mode. And when you read this, it's kind of hard to know what is meant by this if expression. So another powerful thing is to do it like this. Should pause game is equal, and then you write the condition of your if expression. And the thing is, now you can read it from top to bottom more easily, and you know what is meant by this if statement. There might still be a mistake. I always make mistakes in conditions. But if you write it like this, you're forced to think of a name. And thinking of this name will help you understand the next time you read this code. And now I try to keep my if statements really simple. So anytime the condition is more than two things, I put it into a variable. And it helps me. And this is a bit controversial. Write really small files. Yes. And this is my goal. I try to write 100 to 150 line files. You might say, what does it bring you to only have small files? But by doing this, you're forced to separate things at some point. If it becomes more than 150 lines, and if you start thinking, okay, maybe I should create a new file, then you have to think, okay, what does this big file do? How can I separate this? What are the components? And that will help you a lot to make the code better. You have to think of new names and new methods and new ways of how they interact. And it's a very simple tip, but it helped me a lot. So this is from one of my last projects. These are the files sorted by length. These are the biggest files. And this project has, I think, 100 and something files. And you can see that the style sheet is really big, but it's okay. It's only methods that have no logic in there. And then the skill box view, we really need to refactor that. But you can see already at the bottom, it starts getting to 154. And then everything below that is smaller. And just sometimes I don't really know what to work on. And then I start making a list of these files and just start at the biggest one, or the one that bothers me the most. And by doing these things on your code base, your code will become a lot better. And it's really simple. You only have to focus on the number of lines. You can ignore the comments and everything. You just do that, and your code will get better. So if you want to take a picture, this is how you can do that. I also tweeted about it, or you can find it online. But this is a command you can use to find all the .m files in your working directory and sort them by length. So that's another trick. And this is something I'm learning now. I'm trying to use a lot more protocols and not using class inheritance. And this is something that's very difficult to do right, I think. But the nice thing is protocols, you can combine multiple protocols, and protocols can inherit from multiple protocols or extend, but classes can only inherit once. And I found that when I do this, my code gets a bit more clear. Now, there is a line where if you cross it, then it's actually becoming harder to understand. So I was writing an article about a new view controller transitioning API. And there they only use protocols for everything. And it took me weeks to understand how it worked. Once I understood it, it was very simple. But they use protocols, I think, too much, or maybe I'm not used to it enough. So there's a balance. Like, don't use it for everything, but generally using more protocols and less concrete classes makes my code better. And here's another gem. I didn't even bother to format it nicely because I think it was just like this in the code. So this is a method also from the game, of course. It says alert view did dismiss with button index. Then there's an if statement. And then there's 20 more lines. I just replaced them with a comment so you can see what happens. And then inside there's another if statement. And reading this code is really, really hard. If you're going over your own code base or over somebody else's code base, this is really problematic to understand. So what I did instead, I took the second if statement and put it into a separate method. And again, it's really nice. It helps you force to think about how should I name this method. And then your code, again, becomes a lot clearer. So anytime I have nested things, unless it's really, really tiny, I try to put it into separate methods and separate it out. And I found that also it's a simple trick, but it helps me write a lot clearer code. So yeah, that's the same thing. Put it into separate methods. And here's another thing, and not everybody agrees with that. I try to optimize for readability, and I don't try to write the code that is the fastest possible. There are sometimes very good reasons for writing fast code. If you're writing a PDF framework, it might make a lot of sense to write really fast code. But for almost all the apps I write, and I write simple apps for simple clients, I optimize for readability. It's just so much better, and it's really hard sometimes because you know things can be done more efficiently, but if it's easier to read, I almost always go for that. And I guess this is the most controversial thing, is I would encourage everybody to really learn Interface Builder. So almost none of the good Cocoa programmers I know use Interface Builder. I do use it, and I really like it. And it's one of those things, if you invest some love into Interface Builder and into learning the tips and tricks, it can really pay off. The nice thing about Interface Builder is that you can prototype a lot faster, you can change things. And I used to think that if you would use Interface Builder, that you have to go all the way and use it for everything. But you don't. You can use Interface Builder together with code where it makes sense. And recently, things have also become a lot better in Interface Builder, like laying out constraints, for example. I would really encourage you to try that again, because now it's actually nice, and it's a good experience. And there's a lot of hidden tips and tricks. You can create custom objects in Interface Builder. You can set custom properties, like with key value coding. And it really paid off for me. I still write a lot of interface codes, but when I can, I use Interface Builder. And I found that it helps me make more productive and communicate easier with clients also. And some nice stories about learning your frameworks. So this is Brent Simmons. And Brent Simmons, he's a really good programmer. He wrote this RSS reader. And in his RSS reader, he had a massive amount of posts. Like, I don't know, I guess millions. And he needed speed. So he always went away from CoreData because he needed the raw speed of SQLite. And he said this statement at the 27th of September. And this was what happened before, is we asked him, like, please, can you write an article for our magazine about how you use SQLite instead of CoreData? And can you show us what it brings you and why people should do that? Because we think it's important to show all the different viewpoints. And he started writing. And then after a while, he came back to us, and he said, like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't publish this article. I don't think it's a good idea to encourage people to use SQLite. And Florian said, no, you should write it and you should publish it. So he did publish it, and then he wrote this statement and saying, like, yeah, no, I don't like CoreData still. This is 5 October. This is a little bit more than a week later. And he switched completely. And he was this big fan, and people were looking up to him and saying, like, yes, Brent Simmons doesn't use CoreData, so I don't have to either. And as he wrote this article, and as he realized all the things that he had to do himself, he realized that, no, I should actually try it out again and see if it works for me. And it worked. And that's one of the things, like, it's really important, I think, to invest time in these frameworks, because they're going to pay off, and they're going to do a lot of things for you that you cannot do yourself. And that's one of the things I learned. Like, if I look at my game, I was doing all the things myself. And these days, I use CoreData. We didn't have it back then on iOS 2. And I use libraries. I use CocoaPods to reuse things. So these are some things about CoreData, why, for example, why you should use it. So relationships if you want to do this in an object-oriented way, it's quite hard. You have to do a lot of work if you want to do it with SQLite, with raw SQLite. And batching is also one of those things. CoreData just solved it. You can do it in SQLite, but it's a lot easier to make mistakes there, especially when you use NSFetch results controller. You get all of this stuff for free. You get automatic Tableview updates and batch loading, and everything becomes fast and nice and easy. And I have these classes for CoreData that I always drop into my project. And I can just, when I know how an application, how the data model is, I just make my data model in the data model editor, and I write it, and I don't really have to think. It's just, for me, it became really fast to at least make this part of the application. It's a bit painful to learn in the beginning, and it will make you more slow in the beginning because there will be weird errors, and if you use multi-threaded things, it becomes strange. But if you actually learn it properly, and this, for me, it took a long time, it totally pays off. So, value objects. This is another slightly controversial topic. This is what I wrote. I didn't take sample from my game because it didn't fit on the slide, so I wrote a small dictionary. So this is a person dictionary, and it has a name, a birth date, and number of kids. And I use dictionaries everywhere, and dictionaries are really nice because they're very simple. You can just create them and use them everywhere in your code, pass them around, you don't have to think. And it's really handy for quick prototyping. However, there are two problems with dictionaries. So the first one is that if you make mistakes in your keys, you're not going to get an error from the compiler. If you, and this is quite nasty because you might figure out only at runtime that your key doesn't exist or that you typed something wrong. And you can also, it gets really hard to rename these keys because then you have to do string search and it gets a bit icky. And the other thing is, and this is one of the things that's a lot more subtle, but which I found out in the last years that is very important, is this dictionary might be mutated. Somebody might create it as an immutable dictionary. And then they pass it on to your thread, and you think your dictionary doesn't change, but they start changing it. And then weird behavior will happen. And you think, well, this is an exceptional case. And that's exactly the problem, because during testing, you will not find these things. Like mutation bugs, you almost never see them in testing. And it gets really hard to spot these bugs. But they will happen for your users. And that's the nasty thing about mutation. And that's one of the things that when I talk with other people, they also, I see a lot of people who are realizing this and who are also trying to steer away from mutation and from mutable objects. So this is a first step we can take towards better code. So instead of a dictionary, we can create this person object. So this person object has a name and a birth date and a number of kids. And now we at least know that we don't make mistakes in writing the property names because the compiler will complain. This is already really good. But now we still have the problem that your object might be mutated in another thread. So, like I said, it might be very handy, and sometimes it will bite you, and it will bite you hard, mutation. So this is what we can do. It's almost the same, but we make all the properties read-only. And then we add another method, the initializer, and it creates the object once. And I think this is super powerful, because you can create an object, but you can never mutate it anymore. And you know that afterwards, things won't change. And if you're doing multi-threaded programming, this is super powerful. And I mean, we all have to do multi-threaded programming these days. So I use this pattern a lot. Like for almost everything, I create these non-mutable objects. And you just copy them, and if you want to change things, instead of changing the object, you create a new one with changed values. And it makes my code a lot easier. And I'm still learning how to apply this everywhere, but I do notice that it's easier to understand things now. So this is my recommendation. Use lots of these objects, like everywhere, and make them immutable. So the last topic is lighter view controllers. And this is my hobby. Like, everybody knows this problem, right? You have this huge view controller. I think my biggest was about 1,000 lines. I heard of somebody who had a 3,000 line view controller, and I heard of somebody who had a 5,000 line view controller. And it just happens, right? It just magically gets bigger. And the realization I had when I was thinking about this problem is your view controller is the only thing you can really not reuse. You can reuse your models, maybe in a different project or in the same project, and you can reuse your views and model logic. But view controllers are getting, the things that the code you write in there is really hard to reuse. So these are the steps you could take. So you can make smarter views, and by that I don't mean putting model logic in your views, but anything that has to do with layout or that has to do sort of with views, put it in your views. And you can make smarter models. So any model logic, put it into your model layer, and it might sound very obvious, but what I do when I have a big view controller, I go over my code and I read like, oh yeah, this is view code, this is model code, and I put it into the appropriate places. And I think writing it in your view controller is not a big problem as long as you refactor it and put it into the right place afterwards. And this is Orta's tip, the third one. Use view controller transitions. So what you can do if you have one view controller with state, you can separate it into two view controllers and remove that state and use view controller transitions to automatically animate between them. Another thing you can do, and I'm going to show how to do this, is use categories to populate your views. And the last thing is pulling out protocols. I'll also show that. So this is using categories to populate views. It's a very simple example. So it might not make sense in this very case, but in a lot of cases it does. So here we have Tableview self-heroic index path. So first we get a user for this index path, then we get a cell, and then we say cell.textLabel.text is user's name, and the image view.image is the user's avatar. And these last two lines, that's the important thing. And one of the things I learned from somebody is to take these two lines and put them into a separate method, and put this method in a category on the cell. So it looks like this. So here's my custom Tableview cell, and it now has a method, configure for user. And it takes a user. And you set the cell's text label text and the image in this method. And what you have now is not only that your view controller is 2 lines shorter, but you can reuse this code. And especially if it's a bit more complicated, you can use it in multiple view controllers. And your view controller becomes simpler to read. There's, of course, the caveat that now your view controller knows, or now your view knows about your model a little bit. But I think it's in a separate category, so it's not really in your view, and I think it's fine. It makes my code clearer. And this is one of those things that I started doing more and more, and I find that it makes my code simpler. And this is the last thing, pulling out protocols. And here, I remember very fondly, like, I was working on this client project, and there was a big view controller. And I was thinking, what can I do? Like, I didn't see any nice way to refactor this. I was just telling this story yesterday also. I was waiting at the tram line and thinking about this view controller, and what can I do? And then I realized I can take the UI Tableview data source part and put it into its own object. I first didn't believe it and didn't know if it would work, but it turned out that it's perfect. So that's what we're going to do. UI Tableview data source, we're going to make an object that is the UI Tableview data source, and your view controller is not the data source anymore. So this is what this object looks like. I asked it before, and I'm still looking for a better name. I called it fetched results controller data source. And this object is just a plain NS object, and it implements the UI Tableview data source protocol and the fetch results controller delegate. And it looks like this. So this is number of sections in Tableview. It's very simple. It returns the fetch results controller number of sections. The number of rows in sections is also very simple. This object just asks its fetch results controller, okay, give me the section, and then the number of objects. And now it becomes interesting. This is the self-heroic index path. So the first step is to get the object index path. This just asks the fetch results controller. The second step is to get the cell. And then we need to configure this cell. And for that, we're going to use a custom delegate. And this delegate will be the view controller. So the view controller will know how to make this view nice and how to connect the model object with the Tableview cell. And by doing that, you create a class that can be reused everywhere. So your view controller is a bit lighter, but you can test this class also, and that's super powerful. So I hope we're going to learn about that from John later. But this is super cool. You can test this class once, and you use it everywhere. Anytime you use a fetch results controller, you can reuse this. It's another thing is I now showed how to do this for fetch results controller, but you can imagine the same thing for NSArray. You can make a UI Tableview source that takes data source that takes an NSArray and does all the heavy lifting for you, or any other kind of object, a web service maybe. And you can also do this for other protocols. So you can do this for a UI Tableview delegate or for a UI collection view data source. Actually, the class I showed you before, you could implement both UI collection view data source and UI Tableview data source and reuse this thing everywhere. And then you can switch from Tableview to collection view without having to think about that part. It's a really, really powerful trick, and I started doing it a lot. So a lot of my code is just NSObject classes that implement a protocol, and they don't do anything else. So yeah, this is one of the other two examples you could do. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to say. So these things, like if there's anything to remember, is just focus on the person after you. This will make your own life a lot easier because it will probably be you. At least I'm speaking for myself, but I think it's the same for everybody. And learn about your tools. And the last thing, and I think this will also really impact your code, and this is also one of the things I really learned if I look at my game and what I do now, is keeping my view controllers light. I try to have almost nothing in there and put everything into the appropriate places. Okay, the last little bit, I have to make a commercial break. So please read our magazine or check it out at least once. We try to write all these nice articles. And if you want to go to another conference, we do UIConf in Berlin, which is all about iOS programming. And that's all I have to say. Thank you. So I'd be really interested if anybody has questions. Yes?
Yeah, you told about view controller transitions. I haven't understood that part. What do you mean by that?
Okay, the question is, what did I mean by view controller transitions? So the example, for example, that Orta showed me is he had he displayed a view controller with an artwork, like a painting. And he had a painting, and then below that was some description of the painting and some other things. That was his view controller. And then what he did is, if you tap on a painting, it goes to full screen. And you could do that full screen view inside your view controller. You can just animate it to bigger and hide all the other things. An alternative would be to take that full screen view, put it into a separate view controller, and then animate between those two. And then you get rid of this state inside your view controller. And it's a really powerful technique. I have to apply it more, and I'm still, because it's such a new API, I'm still thinking of new ways to use this. But anytime you have like two things that look similar but very different inside your view controller, you can do that. More questions?
So how
Yes.
is UI Tableview controller cool? Why is that?
Why is UI Tableview controller cool? Yes. So because what I always had is I made my I had a Tableview controller, and then at some point I wanted to display something else on top of the Tableview controller. And then what I had to do is take away the Tableview controller, do a normal UI Tableview controller, make a Tableview property, etc. We all been there. And instead of that, what I use now is view controller containment. So I make child view controllers. And then I can still use my Tableview controller because it has a lot of nice things like scrolling to the top. There are a lot of hidden gems. For example, if you have a Tableview controller with text fields inside, and you click on the text field, the Tableview controller will scroll to the right position. So, I think so. I don't know always, but in my testing. And there are a lot of these small things that they implemented in UI Tableview controller, which maybe should have been implemented in UI Tableview, that will help you and make things easier. And it also does the resizing, I think, if I'm correct, for the keyboard. I'm not sure. And this is also before child view controllers, it was not so cool because you would always need to change your UI Tableview controller to a normal one and do everything yourself again. But now with child view controllers, we can use this and not worry about that. Yes.
How many of developers you know are still using the raw dictionaries and things like that? So those you have described as what you've been doing 5 years ago.
Okay, so how many of the developers I know are still using raw dictionaries? I think a lot, and I don't think everybody agrees with me. There's Rich Hickey. He made Closure, and he says you should use dictionaries, and he's very right. He said don't make all these complicated classes, and he has a good point. Because in a way, dictionaries are simpler. I don't know how many of the developers I know use dictionaries, but you can make a really good case for using dictionaries. It's just, I think that using classes and having the compiler help you and making sure that you cannot mutate things, make it simpler, because I don't then, once I stick to these principles, I don't have to think about it anymore. But other people might say, well, no, you're exaggerating. I'm smart enough to not make these mistakes. And a lot of people are smart enough to do it. But I am not, so that's why I do it.
And the people after you can't guarantee they're going to be smart enough.
Yeah, the people after you cannot guarantee that they're smart enough. Yeah, yeah.
Well, actually, I do agree with your points, and I share your opinion. But the question is, how many of your fellow developers that you know, that you work with, do not share these principles?
Okay, the developers that I work with who don't share these principles. I think everybody I work with does the same thing. So either I've been successful at convincing them, or they also think it's a good idea. Yeah, no, like most of the people I work with have limited capacity, just like me, and we just need to do this because otherwise it gets a mess. I don't think I know anybody off the top of my head who uses dictionaries instead of these classes. I mean, everybody does it sometimes, right? But I don't know anybody personally that's a fan of the other way. Any other questions? Okay, cool. Then if you have more questions, grab me in the break or later and have fun with the other talks.